You will think me cruel, very selfish, but love is always selfish. The more ardent, the more selfish. Hey everyone, welcome back to a novel review, the book podcast, where every week I review a different book. This is the Halloween special, so today on the pod we have a spooky story, the dark Sapphic romance that inspired Dracula, that precedes Dracula by 25 years, Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla. Wonderful little story, can't wait to dive into that for a spooky little episode. But first, I do want to briefly chat about some other essential Halloween reading that I have been doing just to get us in the mood. Oh yes, if you're on YouTube, I do have a candle here lit, which is all kinds of fun to wander the house in the night. I have here these 3 Penguin archives that I bought. I bought quite a few now along my journeys to various bookshops because one, they just look so nice, the white covers and red writing. I have spoken about them before, about how I sort of love and hate them because the book publishing industry sometimes feels a bit vampiric in that they suck the lifeblood out of us, the consumers, because they put on a beautiful cover, or they think if they put on a beautiful cover of a book that we absolutely love, that we will absolutely buy that book for the artwork, despite the fact that the story is more or less the same. And they are absolutely right, because we always do. However, these Penguin archives, I think, are actually really, really fantastic because they provide an accessibility to a model of story that otherwise we wouldn't, or necessarily we might not have access to, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So it's often short stories, essays, literary essays, or poetry, something like that, something that is smaller, that does need to be consumed in more bite-sized chunks. And that's what I kind of love about them. I know in the Penguin archives, they have published as well. I think there's one of the publications is a chapter from the Iliad, like the Wrath of Achilles, I believe it's called. And for something like that, I'm a bit less interested in that because it's like £6 for these smaller Penguin archives, when the actual book, the whole Iliad, is £10 or something. So unless you're a particular huge fan of that one particular chapter of the Iliad, it does feel kind of a bit wasteful, and it does feel a bit, I don't know, crazy to start like chopping up books based on chapters. However, for these 3 books that are my essential vampire readings, not vampire readings, Halloween readings for the episode, I think it's absolutely fantastic because they're short stories of brilliant authors that deserve to have short stories recognized. And I think the short stories are a really lovely way to, or a really great way that writers can develop as writers themselves. But it's also just a really strong component of storytelling. And some writers are really great short story writers, but of course, because it's hard to sell them, they don't succeed in the same way that people who write novels do. So first up, Bram Stoker's The Burial of the Rats. I think everyone knows Bram Stoker. He wrote Dracula. And the reason I bought this is because the first short story in this is actually rumored to be the original first chapter for Dracula that Bram Stoker, for whatever reason, didn't go with. And I read it, and I mean, I love Bram Stoker. I love Dracula. I think Bram Stoker's writing has a very distinct voice and style, and so to sort of get that insight into what the first chapter could have been was absolutely fresh and wonderful and interesting, and just perfectly bite-sized in this accessible format. Edgar Allan Poe, I mean, just a classic Gothic writer. His short stories are incredibly famous, and I think incredibly I just never see him that much, and I think he is so underrated because he is so brilliant. I think he's one of those writers that everyone knows about, but no one's really read that much, at least in my experience. M.R. James, The Stalls of Barchester Hall, is one that I've picked up. I've never read any M.R. James, but I am very keen to get into him because he seems like another Gothic kind of writer, ghost story kind of writer. And it is rumoured that M.R. James and Bram Stoker were inspired by the book today, Carmilla. So I thought I'd just highlight those 3 little bite-sized books for you. I think it's really lovely to get them in this sort of format because, yeah, they're all short stories. They're short, they're accessible. The books themselves are smaller, so you can slot them in your back pocket. And yeah, I've had a lot of fun with them so far, despite my initial sort of wrestling with them, duality of whether they're good or bad for the book and publishing industry and the consumers, as well as us, the people reading them. But yeah, anyways, let's get into the book. Okay, Carmilla, Sheridan Le Fanu, holding it up for the benefit of those on YouTube. It's a wonderful little book, both as a book and as a story. And I mean, the book itself is really, really nice. It's published by Pushkin Press, and this particular edition is really interesting, actually. It's got kind of a I mean, I'm kind of scratching it. I don't know if you can hear that, but it's got kind of like a plasticky cover. And what that has done is it's made it really hard to actually put any kind of marks or dents on it. It's quite a stiff book, but the spine has remained unbroken. It's a bit vampiric, I guess, in that it seems ageless. You know, I've sort of been flipping through it multiple times. I've of course read it, and it doesn't, like, it looks completely brand new. It looks like I could have just picked it up off the shelves. The spine is in complete tact. There's not even a indication that it's been read. So, I mean, it's kind of beautiful for that reason, but I wouldn't, you know, I mean, it feels like I wouldn't even be able to snap the spine even if I wanted to without causing the structural integrity of the book some real damage that could really, yeah, mess it up. So it does feel a bit vampiric in that it doesn't seem to age at all, which I kind of love. The story itself, I think, was really, really interesting. And the reason I say it like that is I am quite interested in stories that are technically, you know, in inverted commas, the first of their genre. So I really love Treasure Island as a story because it is the first kind of vampire story. It's the first kind of treasure, X marks the spot pirate story is sort of what I'm going for there. Now, I'm not too caught up in the vampire world. In fact, to be honest, I've only read Dracula. No, that's a lie. I have read Twilight as well, actually, a long, long time ago. But I've really only kind of read Dracula more than once. I'm not huge in the vampire world, so there absolutely could be other vampire stories that I'm not aware of that predate Carmilla. But as far as I'm aware, this is sort of seen as one of, if not the first vampire novel. So I really love stories that are kind of brokering new ground for that reason. And I think, you know, in terms of if we're reading it on an isolated, with an isolated perspective from right now, it might not score that highly, but the fact that it is technically the first, I think it does score a lot higher than what it does, because you don't want to bring too many modern sentiments into it and mark it down, because it was doing something quite fantastic of its day. And I was really, really impressed with that, but I'll speak about that, of course, right now. I think I should probably do a brief overview. Laura is a young girl completely isolated in the Styrian mountains, living with her widowed father, when one day this cart pulls up and there's this young girl who's quite sick in the cart. Her mother says, "This is Carmilla, she's quite sick. Can she," or she doesn't say, "Can she stay here?" But the father is like, "Please, she must absolutely stay here while you continue on her journey." The mother is like, "That's fine, but I can't come back for 3 months. This is a really important task I'm on." And the father's like, "Don't worry about it, leave her here. She's the same age as my daughter. So, you know, perchance they will have a relationship," and this relationship is a friendship, of course. And basically what starts from there is this friendship between Carmilla and Laura as they sort of start to get to know each other. Then there's, of course, this coded sexuality that infiltrates the story in their relationship, and then it sort of all comes to a head when we learn that as Laura gets more sicker and sort of Carmilla gets progressively better from her illness, that Carmilla is, of course, a vampire, and we need to actually do something about that. So that's an incredibly brief overview, but it's about two girls that sort of have this relationship, and one of them is a vampire. So as I said, the book does predate Dracula. It was serialized over 1871 to 1872. It is quite a short book. This particular edition is only 150 pages long, and they're not very long pages. I'll be quite honest, I read it in one sitting, just because I had a bit of time, and it was quite an engaging story that I just pushed through right to the end. It was an okay book. It wasn't a terrible book. It wasn't an absolutely fantastic book. I didn't feel completely swept along with it, but it was interesting enough to finish. You know, as I said, it's only 150 pages and you can read it in one sitting. I think that's kind of like a mark for it and a mark against it. But I do also have to admit that, you know, because it was serialized, it would have come out in much smaller bite-sized chunks. And so a lot of the mystery of it, a lot of the intrigue of it probably would have built a lot slower over the course of the months that it was published. Whereas my ability to pretty much read it in one sitting probably detracted something from my read. But of course, I have to, be honest there and say that if it had been serialized, it might have been a lot more engaging and a lot more interesting, because certain chapters end in cliffhangers, and obviously we love a cliffhanger. We hate a cliffhanger, but we secretly love them. So if it had been serialized, I would have gone back and probably reread that chapter again and tried to delve into the book a bit more and be eagerly waiting for the next chapter. But of course, I just had the absolute accessibility to just power through. So that kind of, I think, took something away. My candle's kind of losing all structural integrity over here and collapsing. I think that kind of took something away from the read, but that's also just a modern affection upon the story itself. Again, the beat points of the story felt very stereotypical. The setting of the story felt very stereotypical. These elements of the story do feel stereotypical, but again, being the first one, we have to give it that pass. So, it was told in a very isolated situation. It takes place in the Styrian mountains in Austria, which I've heard of, but don't know too much about of. It takes place in a large sort of, castle, almost kind of house, a big manor house kind of thing. There's a lot of nocturnal activity. There's a lot of sexuality. There's a lot of predation going on. So it does feel quite stereotypical to the vampire novel, and that only other novel I've really read that sort of I can compare it to is the one that came out not too long after Dracula. But it did read quite similar, and I don't know, but it does feel like Bram Stoker has read this book, taken the best elements of it, and built upon it to build something that I think is better in Dracula. But of course, this isn't a podcast to compare the two books. We're trying to look at it with the individualism that it deserves. So even though I think Dracula is a tiny bit better, I still really enjoyed this book. I thought it had some wonderful elements. It read as incredibly ethereal. It read as incredibly beautiful. It was really, really visual. This is a language that I am really interested by, the Romantic language. It's in the Victorian era. I've got a few quotes here that I do want to read through the course of the episode because, I just think they sort of highlight the language that you're dealing with, but also the imagery and just sort of what the kind of story is. So here's one quote I want to start with. For some nights I slept profoundly, but still every morning I felt the same lassitude, and a languor weighed upon me all day. I felt myself a changed girl. A strange melancholy was stealing over me, a melancholy that I would not have interrupted. Dim thoughts of death began to open, and an idea I was slowly sinking took gentle and somewhat not unwelcome possession of me. If it was sad, the tone of mind which this induced was also sweet. And I just kind of love these stories for their use of language. For some nights I slept profoundly, just like it's so profound in the way it exercises itself. Whereas these days we'd probably just say, I slept well last night, I had a good sleep or something like that. But to these people, it was a profound sleep. It was this great sleep that it was profound. And I really love the use of the English language within the books. I think it's really all-encompassing. They really do embellish a lot, which I really, really enjoy because I love the English language. I love seeing it play out on the page. I love the use of all language. And it is just one of those aspects that I do really appreciate about these particular stories in the way that they are so over the top. Obviously, I don't love people just being randomly over the top for no reason to the point that it does feel, overly dramatic or dramatic for something like that. But just the idea that you could describe sleep as profound is something that I don't think is utilized as much anymore, at least in the books that I'm currently reading. So I really, really love it for that. Like I said, it does paint a wonderful picture throughout the story. Sorry, I just bumped the mic there. It does paint this wonderful picture throughout the story. I loved Carmilla as a character. I've got my notes here. I thought she was powerful, independent, confident. She does feel like she's a direct threat to the patriarchal societies that are dominating the day. One thing I was wondering and thinking and sort of, thinking about is she the dark mirror to Laura's repression? Is she Laura's desire that is what is sort of socially accepted versus what is morally good? Is she this kind of dark mirror almost being held up to Laura in real time? I found their relationship really, really immediate and really interesting because, I'm going to say I haven't read too much vampire literature, but it felt like Carmilla as the vampire was really intimately involved in a human way with Laura the character, and I don't know if that necessarily is something that you always get with Dracula and of course the opening chapters with Jonathan Harker. There is that homoerotic tension between them as it's sort of touted, but it never really felt like Dracula was close to Jonathan Harker in a way that was emotionally close. It felt like Dracula was always sort of somewhat removed, whereas Carmilla as a character, there is that the sexually erotic companion to Laura, that idea that she is a sexual being, and there's the relationship between them. But it also felt like she was incredibly close to Laura emotionally, which I found really interesting. In terms of the sexuality of the story, because it is touted as this sort of lesbian vampire story, It honestly, for me, didn't read too much like that, but I think that might just be the different stages in which I'm reading it. I'm bringing modern sentiments to it rather than the Victorian sentiments. This is sort of the extent to what it is sexual, and I'll read this paragraph here, and I'll let you make up your own mind, of course. Sometimes, after an hour of apathy, my strange and beautiful companion would take my hand and hold it with a fond pressure, renewed again and again. Blushing softly, gazing in my face with languid and burning eyes, and breathing so fast that her dress rose and fell with the tumultuous respiration. It was like the ardour of a lover. It embarrassed me. It was hateful and yet overpowering, and with gloating eyes she drew me to her, and her hot lips travelled along my cheek in kisses, and she would whisper almost in sobs, "You are mine. You shall be mine. You and I are one forever." Then she had thrown herself back in her chair, with her small hands over her eyes, leaving me trembling. That's sort of the level of what we're talking about when we say this is a lesbian vampire story. There is a lot that's sort of left between the lines that you've got to read and sort of infer for yourself. And that's not just in the relationship as well. That's throughout the course of the entire story, which is something I really, really love about the story, because it does leave a few questions. It does leave you wondering yourself as the reader, and it does leave a few questions unanswered. And none of those questions that are left unanswered detract anything from the overarching story or remove anything from the conclusion of the story. You don't get to the end and think, oh, they didn't answer that, so the whole thing is almost nonsensical. It all does make sense, but it does leave that ethereal sense of something unanswered, which I kind of really, really love within the course of the story. I think one more thing that I noticed, of course, in Dracula, but then this as well, it does have that kind of political sentiment of this idea of someone coming into a small town or an area and infecting the locals and killing the locals, because Carmilla, as she progresses as the character, does start to kill the locals, or the locals start to get sick and die from a mystery illness. And we, of course, as the reader, know that is the result of a vampire going out and sucking the blood. And it's kind of like this idea of immigrants coming in and sucking the blood of the locals. And it's a sentiment that runs pretty profoundly through Dracula as well, and this as well. So it's just kind of that idea that Carmilla is a foreigner herself. She is poisoning and corrupting the locals, and the politics of immigration throughout the story. So you can see, even though it's a relatively brief novel, like I said, 150 pages, it does pack a lot in. One of the things I really loved about Carmilla is the subtlety of it. It does feel incredibly ethereal. It does feel incredibly distant, and it does feel like a lot's happening off the page that we're not necessarily privy to. For that, it does create this wonderful atmospheric, moody kind of setting. And of course, like I said, all the stereotypical settings for a vampire story, the isolation of the castle, but of course the isolation that Laura herself must be feeling as a young girl growing up, completely removed from society. And there is that naturality that as soon as someone else her own age is placed within her immediate confines in Carmilla, that she would naturally latch on in a certain way. And I think I really, really love the development of their relationship, but also the moody aspect to it, the fact that so much was left unsaid, the fact that so much was left off the page. It just left a few things to your imagination, which of course just builds that ethereal sense. It builds that kind of moody sense, the smoke and the mirrors kind of situation that's going on here. So I thought I really, really loved it. I think you can read it for so many different reasons. You can just read it as a base vampire story if that's what you're looking for. You can read it as this sort of lesbian coded vampire story. You can also read it for, as I said, perhaps the politics, if that's what you're interested in and quite enjoy that aspect of the story. So you can absolutely read it from that lens. So yeah, I quite enjoyed this book. It was a recommendation from a listener. I did purposely save it for Halloween. So thank you so much for the recommendation. It is short, it is sweet, it is moody. It hasn't eclipsed Dracula for me. I still think that is a better book, but of course, Bram Stoker probably took the best parts of this and just built on them. So we can't judge it for that. I think for me, what would I rate this book out of 5? For me, it's probably going to be a 3.6 out of 5. So that was Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla. Okay, here we are at the end of the spooky episode, the episode for Halloween. The candle has burned down. I was going to say slowly, but it's actually burned down a lot quicker than I thought it would, to be quite honest. There is a lot of wax now pooling here in the little wax pooling, so that's my cue that this episode is done. Thanks so much, guys. I hope to see you next time. Bye.